Hello, once again. Welcome to our episode on Reality on You Foundation. Today we have with us the esteemed speaker, Dr. Michael Pluess. He's a PhD psychologist and a professor in developmental psychology at the Department of Biological and Experimental Psychology at the Queen Mary University of London. Doctor, you have a special interest in developmental plasticity, which we are going to dig into more. He also studies the effects of environmental influences on experiences and growth and on human developmental, with a special interest in gene and environmental interaction. We will further talk about the positive developmental rather than talking about, developmental psychopathology. Today, we'll talk about, how kindness is and sensitivity is affected in the world. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. If you want to add a little bit about you.
Well, just thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be on this podcast. I'm looking forward to discussing the various questions that you have on your mind. I think all those topics obviously are very
So, Doctor,
important to my heart.
I just want to start off with, right the fundamental stage of human development, which is, the prenatal environment. So in terms of the prenatal environment, how does that affect the brain of the child?
Well, the majority of brain development happens during the prenatal period, right? So a child that is born has a fully developed brain, which continues to develop after that. But the majority of the brain development occurs in the prenatal period. So therefore, any experiences during the prenatal period that have an impact on the child's brain development are likely to have a significant impact. And we do know that experiences during the prenatal period are associated with various behavioral outcomes of the children. For example, temperament of the newborn baby is affected by the quality of the environment that they experienced during the prenatal period. Usually that's measured with a mother report of stress, anxiety, and so forth.
So you're saying that while the child is in the womb of the mother, during the 9-month phase, that phase, the stressful phase or the anxiety, determines the temperament of the child once the child is born.
I wouldn't say determine, but influence. They influence. So obviously you have, for most behavioral outcomes, you have a genetic component, which is influencing the basic behavior and tendencies of an individual, but then the environmental conditions starting as early as actually before pregnancy, even during conception, before conception, can have an impact on the development of an individual. So we are all shaped by the environment we grow up in, and it starts actually before pregnancy, during conception. At least that's what research suggests. And it can be tricky to investigate, what are the specific experiences that have an impact on the child, because the mothers are behaving in certain ways that reflect their personality. I think an important point to make is it's not just the stressful experiences during pregnancy, but it's also the positive experiences. We found some research that the positive life events during pregnancy had an impact on the mother's cortisol levels, a hormone that's released often in relation to stress, but it has multiple functions. But cortisol levels increase during pregnancy substantially, and most of that is filtered out of the blood of the baby. The fetus doesn't receive everything from the mother, but some of the cortisol can go through the placenta, and then the hypothesis is that this affects children. However, what I've been finding in some of my research, that most of the work focuses on negative life events, stress, how that leads to increased cortisol levels and then affects the child. What I've been able to show with my work is that actually, if mothers experience positive life events, it reduces their cortisol. And maybe we should focus not just on the negative, the stress experienced during the pregnancy, but often that's not something we can change easily. But we should focus on the positive and make sure that a pregnant mother receives all the support that she needs and can deal with the anxiety that she may have regarding becoming a mother and so forth.
Wow, that's great news. So I think mothers have to, give themselves a lot of compassion, a lot of kindness, and I think that is something that has been reinforced very much in the culture that I come from in India. So, Doctor, I just want to step away and just talk about, plasticity of the human brain. So when we talk about plasticity, just for the viewers, can you sort of define that in layman's term?
Yeah, with plasticity, we generally mean that the brain can be formed and shaped. So plasticity means, or maybe I can explain it with the extreme opposite to plasticity would be that it's fixed.
Right.
Basically, this would mean if the brain was fixed in the development, it would mean it develops independently of what we experience, right? But the brain is designed in such a way that the environment has an impact on it. And so depending on the specific experiences that we make, the specific conditions of our environment, our brain will develop in slightly different ways. And that is a good thing because it means our brain adapts to the realities of our lives. And this plasticity is particularly strong in the first few years of life.
Right.
This is where the brain has created a multitude of synapses, connections between neurons, but only not all of those connections are needed. And actually, when we use the brain, the connections that are being in use are being retained, and the connections that are not being used, they basically are being removed. And that's a process that happens in the early years. Actually, most of the brain cells that a human has already are developed at the end of pregnancy. But the difference is the connections between those brain cells. There's still new brain cells being formed, but the majority of the plasticity is the connections between brain regions. And actually, there's research suggesting that aspects or qualities of the environment during the prenatal period are associated with specific brain regions, the structure of brain regions. But so plasticity happens to some degree across all of life, but predominantly in the first few years of life, and then again around the puberty period. That's where we sort of see windows where more change is possible. And usually the change has as a goal to adapt the child to the specific environment it grows up in.
So, when you're talking about plasticity and it's happening right from, when the child is born, what can the positive influences be, in terms of giving delivery, nurturing the child when the child is born, the fundamental developmental years of childhood? What positive influences can potentially have an impact on, the personality of the child?
So there's basically two basic things that the children need. The first thing is they need the basic needs met. So
Right.
they need the basic nutrients. As if you think of you watering a plant, what does the plant need? Um, it needs some substrate to be planted in to grow its roots, and it needs nutrients, it needs water. So that's basically providing the child with nutrition, but also providing the child with acceptance and love. That are the basic nutrients which a child needs for growth. Then on top of that, the child needs stimulation, cognitive stimulation or social stimulation that is appropriate for the age of the child. So that means the child is exposed to new experiences that help them to develop skills, including, language, including walking,
Yeah.
including problem solving, interacting with other people. in order to do that, the child needs cognitive stimulation, needs opportunities to develop those skills, to practice those skills. A lot of that is done in play or in interaction between adults and the child. So that's important to basically provide an accepting and safe environment where the child feels safe, the child feels loved, and the child forms a secure attachment and then is, interested to explore the world, their environment, and learn new things about it and figure out how things working. And for that, the child needs to have opportunities, and that's summarized in the term of stimulation. They need to have the right kind of stimulation at different stages of development. That needs to look a little bit different.
Doctor, we have seen post-COVID, the environmental influences were fairly negative. We've seen a huge rise in mental health among kids, among adults all across the world. I see the same in India. So in terms of, development till, experiences, what can we today, through the research and the understanding of what we have, what can we reinforce? Because we are seeing very high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide among kids.
Well, that's a challenging. We see an increase of mental health, particularly amongst girls, in many areas across the world. We also see a decline in child well-being.
Yes.
So some of that will be the result of the pandemic, but I think it's probably more than that. I think there's maybe social changes, such as the internet, social media, and the work patterns of more and more children growing up in care rather than at home.
Yeah.
I mean, childcare and so forth, and pressures in school, worries about climate change and the future of the world, with lots of very tricky political situations, and it seems like an increase of war. So I think all of those things are coming together. And yes, the pandemic has had a negative impact on some children, not all of them, but some of them. And I think that's probably to a large degree because the reduction of certain support structures that they had access to, such as just going to school, they're meeting their friends, and being able to socialize. I think that's quite important. So that's obviously that combined with maybe worries about relatives or worries about health. It was quite a difficult period, and I think if for people that already have a vulnerability to be anxious, it would have made things a lot worse.
So I just want to know that, since there's been a huge rise, of course, there's been a huge voice and support to mental health and to issues around mental health. Do we believe that people have become highly sensitive? Do we, are we changing in terms of the experience that we are having? Because like you said, external influences have a huge impact on the way we think, we feel, and we behave. Are we just becoming sensitive in our relationships, life, work?
I don't know whether there's any evidence for that. But I do know that sensitivity, according to our studies on looking at heritability using twin study designs, we find that there is a significant genetic component to sensitivity. So that means for someone that has no genetic predisposition to be sensitive, it's probably unlikely they will become very sensitive. But there is an environmental contribution as well. So you find the heritability of 47%, which means that in a group of people, 47% of the differences between people are explained by genetic factors, which means the rest of the variance, all of the difference is explained by environmental factors. So this suggests two things. Firstly, it suggests that genetics are important
Right.
and that genetics have an influence the level that someone has regarding their sensitivity. But it also suggests that the environment will have an almost equal influence. And my understanding of that is that for people that have a genetic predisposition to be sensitive, the environment that they experience will shape their specific sensitivity. But I think it's unlikely that people that have a low degree of genetic sensitivity will become highly sensitive because of the pandemic or other experiences. Most likely, those people that experienced mental health problems were those that already carried some level of a vulnerability with them. And we do know that sensitivity is associated with a higher risk for the development of depression, anxiety.
So
At the
are there,
same time,
sorry.
the highly sensitive people benefit more from positive experiences, but they're more likely to develop depression, anxiety than others.
So I just wanted to start off with, so, a particular do we have particular characteristics of what defines a highly sensitive person?
Absolutely. So the simplest definition that I've come up with or I'm aware of is that it reflects the capacity to perceive and process information about the environment or about internal experiences as well. So basically, a highly sensitive person is a person that's particularly perceptive, so perceives sensory information. They may be more aware visually of what's going on. They might have a heightened sense of hearing and so forth. They're more perceptive of social situations, how someone feels, how they, whether they can see the emotional expression in their faces. So they perceive more of that. So they extract more information from the environment, and then they also process that more deeply. So that would explain why they're more impacted by experiences they make. So everyone is sensitive, but it's a continuum. It's a dimension, and along this dimension, some people have a lower sensitivity, and some people have a higher sensitivity. And according to our research, we do find that about 30% of the population could be considered highly sensitive. Means they are particularly sensitive to experiences they make, both the negative and positive ones, and they process that more deeply. And the mechanism underlying that is likely that their brains process this information slightly differently.
You said they process, experiences differently. Would they also then react differently to the stimulus, to behaviors, to interactions in the environment?
Yeah, the differences in how they perceive and process information would then likely influence their behavior. But that may also depend on the specific situation they're in. That's why when I talk about sensitivity, I'm not necessarily talking about behaviors, because much of that is internal. So it depends very much on the person's context, how it will result in behaviors. But there's lots of research, specifically in children, that show that highly sensitive children tend to develop more problematic behaviors, such as aggressive behaviors, when they're raised by parents that are more aggressive themselves. But they are also developing a higher social competence when their parents raise them, more cautiously by providing clear rules and boundaries, whilst also providing emotional acceptance and support.
Oh, wow, that's nice. So you were talking about, the positive experiences of sensitivity and being sensitive. We all understand that, yes, aggression levels among kids have increased. the negative influences of social media or the news, the media that's there. So what could be potentially the positive experiences of a highly sensitive person?
So there are positive aspects to being sensitive, and so that I would differentiate that from the positive experiences. So the positive aspects are that a person that is highly sensitive might be more perceptive. So they are better at understanding how someone else feels. So they have higher empathy levels. Sometimes they're more creative,
Right.
um, because that requires really thinking about something and looking at it from different angles and coming up with new ideas. So these are some of the positives. And a positive environment is one, or a positive experience is one in which the highly sensitive person can learn something or experiences, support, but also, I guess, can be themselves without having to worry too much about others. And we see in our studies that, particularly in children, that highly sensitive children benefited more from school-based programs. There's one program where we were helping children to develop resilience.
Yep.
And we looked at their depression symptoms, and we found that in highly sensitive children, their depression symptoms significantly decreased, and remained low over the period of the study. Whereas for the low sensitive children, there was no impact of the program whatsoever. And we see similar results with an anti-bullying intervention, that the sensitive children benefited most from the reduction of bullying. And so they reported less victimization. So I guess this means that as the social climate improved because of a reduction of bullying, the well-being of sensitive children increased, and they themselves were victimized less. So these are some school environments. We also measured. This is still work that still research we're working on, but we found that the emotional and instructional quality of the classroom that the teachers provide,
Right.
they affect highly sensitive children more strongly. And in this particular study, which was conducted in London in the UK, we found that the highly sensitive children that were in less supportive classrooms were more likely to develop depression, anxiety symptoms.
So, since they are processing emotions more deeply, is there like a sensory overload? Do we need to, like you said, there has to be adequate intervention for them? Uh, so what sort of intervention or strategies are we teaching educators, to handle highly sensitive kids? Is there a particular way we can, identify, because we don't want to isolate them from the rest of the clan?
Yeah, exactly. I think so. The highly sensitive children, there are benefits to being highly sensitive, as I just mentioned, but there's also downsides to being highly sensitive. And one of the key areas that are a bit more negative and more difficult or challenging for highly sensitive children or adults is that they are more likely to be overstimulated. That means if they're in an environment that is very busy or chaotic, that they will feel overwhelmed after some time, and more easily so than other people. So let's say if a highly sensitive person has lots of meetings at work, there's a lot to process, a lot to perceive and process. So highly sensitive people get tired and overwhelmed by that. So the same with children. If they're in a classroom that is very chaotic with lots of children running around and shouting, and they will perceive all that noise, they will register all that noise and be aware of maybe conflicts or tensions between people. So they get tired and overwhelmed. So what all highly sensitive people need is time to decompress, time to recover, and to recharge. And if they have that, then they will probably do as well or better than other children or other adults. So it's a key aspect is to be aware that overstimulation is common amongst highly sensitive people, and that it's very important that they have good self-management strategies in place, that they know when they need a break, that they plan to have breaks, so that they can function to their best level. And that is usually when they're not overstimulated. So it should be key to avoid overstimulation or to manage it well, and the sense of overwhelm.
So you said one was decompress, and then what was the second strategy?
Decompress, recover, recharge.
Yep.
They all basically mean the same thing. That means if you're in a overstimulating environment, you need to put yourself into a place where there is no overstimulation, or maybe a reduced stimulation. So that means a calm and quiet room with, pleasant lighting, and maybe without other people, or with people that you feel very comfortable with. For some people, just a little bit of time in a room like that is going to be helpful. For other people, really benefit from going for a walk outside, without your phone, and just enjoy the nature. We do find that highly sensitive people really enjoy nature, which obviously can be a bit more challenging in a big city. But even in a big city, there are parks, or maybe there are other places where people feel that it does good to them.
So is there a particular sensory stimulation? So like, are we saying that they are highly sensitive people, maybe, startled by, say, noise or sound, where we've got cases where we've got children who go to birthday parties and they find it extremely overwhelming to, go through the loudspeakers and the dancing music, and it gets very overwhelming experience for them. So would that also be related to sensitivity?
Some of that, yes, absolutely. So we do find that a highly sensitive child or an adult, when they're facing a new situation that can be overwhelming because there's so many new things to be aware of, that they often need a bit of time to get used to it. So you will see a highly sensitive child at a birthday party, not directly running into the center of it, but being on the side and just watching for a few minutes. And then after some time, they might feel they've processed everything and they're comfortable, and then they go and play with the others. So that would be a very typical behavior of a highly sensitive person. It's not necessarily to not get involved with others, but to first take a bit of time to assess the situation, get familiar with it, and then get engaged. But yes, if it's a birthday party and there's a lots of noise and chaos, for a highly sensitive child, even after a little time, they will probably feel it's too much and they will need to go out and have a bit of a break and maybe play by themselves a little bit,
So
or
as
just be in an environment that is a bit calmer.
So as caregivers, what can parents do, or like we said, educators do, once they've identified, that somebody may be getting overwhelming? One was, yes, give them a quieter space, let them decompress, recharge, and recover, but in a working environment as well, I mean, sometimes because of, like we said, constraints of the city, that may not be possible. Is there a particular meditation or, a program that they can follow?
So highly sensitive people might benefit from mindfulness. We've done some research on some of that, and we did find, so this wasn't mindfulness, it was a different kind of meditation. But it was a guided meditation, and we did find that highly sensitive people benefited from that. But I'm not sure that this is the solution for every single highly sensitive person. So often we talk about highly sensitive people and we think they're all the same, but obviously they're different. And so one person will be more sensitive to noise, another person maybe not. Some people are really sensitive to caffeine, other people are not. And I think some of that is because if you grow up as a highly sensitive individual in a city, and the city is your normal environment, then you probably get used to some of that. And yeah, and you won't experience it the same way as someone that's grew up in a village and then comes to the city. And everyone that's in a village coming to a city feels a bit overwhelmed by everything. But if you grow up in a city, then it's the hustle and bustle that you're used to, so it just feels normal. But yeah, I guess in a city, it might be a matter of still going out for a walk. Maybe there's a park. Some people benefit from noise cancelling headphones.
Yeah.
Because that deals with some of the noise around them. Listening to music that they found relaxing or that they find nice to listen to.
My question is also, for adults, we know that work environments have become more chaotic. Post-COVID, people have started going back and work has started in a full-fledged from, the office space. So in terms of, adults, does the sensitivity sort of go down as we age? Do we get more adapted to the chaos, or are we becoming more sensitive as we age?
So we don't know very much about the development of sensitivity. So I don't have any data on that, but I would expect that there would be some change. We usually find that young children are more sensitive, and then over time that sensitivity reduces a little bit. And that could be because their emotion regulation improves, or they are able to select environments that are better suited to them. So that could be potential reasons for that. But because it's a genetically informed trait, sensitivity is not going to go completely away for people that have a genetic predisposition for it. But yes, so each person, whether they have a low or a high sensitivity, need to figure out what is best for them, right? And to find a work environment that is good for them. And I think an open office with lots of people on phones is a difficult environment for many people, but particularly for highly sensitive ones, it's not ideal.
And how should highly sensitive people navigate relationships? Relationships sometimes can be very complex, very dramatic. In terms of relationships, having partners, we've also seen a huge rise of divorces and infidelity. Is it because we are not valuing the sensitivity of the other?
I mean, maybe that's the case for some people. I think the highly sensitive individuals have the potential to be great partners because they're more aware of the other person, and so it's a good thing. But at the same time, they have a tendency to ruminate maybe on the negative. So it depends on, I would say, other factors in the relationship as well. But it's yeah, there's books that have been written about that by Elaine Aron. She wrote several books on sensitivity. So I'm not really an expert in that, but we did a study recently where we measured the genetics of sensitivity, and we wanted to see whether genetically sensitive people are responding more to a relationship intervention. And what we found was quite interesting. So we found that in the longer term, genetically sensitive individuals benefited from the relationship intervention, and that showed in higher marital satisfaction, better, more positive communication, less negative communication with their partners. So it had positive effects. But in the short term, it had the opposite effect. So it was a very short intervention, only a weekend. So immediately after the intervention, sensitive people had lower marital satisfaction. And I think it's because as part of the intervention, they have to do exercises where they talk about conflicts
Right.
and difficult topics with their partners. And I think in the short term, they found that uncomfortable. But longer term, I believe they applied what they've learned as part of the program and therefore benefited. And that's generally what I hypothesize is the reason why we do see a more positive response of sensitive people to interventions, because I think they internalize what they've learned more deeply and then are applying that. Whereas maybe a low sensitive person will hear in a therapy session or will hear about the strategy, but they're not really process it and they're not really applying it.
So then, because the processing is high among sensitive people, the depth is more stronger, do they need to establish firm boundaries in their relationships? Do they need to have different communication strategies?
I think, first of all, they need to understand their sensitivity. So they need to know whether they're sensitive and they need to understand what that means for them. And it may not necessarily be associated with any challenges that they experience. But if sensitivity plays a role in any challenge that they experience, then they should look into potential strategies of how to deal with that. Clearly, having boundaries in place is an important thing in relationships, and communication is important as well. So I think the boundaries maybe that sensitive people benefit from is more to understand where does the other person end and where do I begin? Because I think there is a tendency to take on the problems of other people, to experience the emotions of someone else, and then to be really deeply affected by that. Whereas I think someone that has a less of sensitivity, if they're next to someone who has a bad day or feels really frustrated, they may not find that pleasant, but it may not affect them as much. Whereas for a sensitive person, it could be quite unpleasant because they feel or sort of sense the negativity of the other person more.
So, like you said, maybe the highly sensitive person is, more empathetic about the other, is doing more for the other, but also getting drained in the process. So I do have
Yeah.
a lot of clients who feel that, they've done a lot, they don't feel appreciated, and, they end up in a depression, because they have chosen to do that extra effort. So they don't know what is the right boundary or self-care for themselves. Do we have any tips that we can give them in terms of how to take care of themselves while they, are empathizing with the other?
Yeah, so I guess most suggestions coming from a relationship expert would apply to that. I think it's important to communicate quite clearly. It's important to communicate the expectations, right? So I think the challenge that you have with a highly sensitive person is because they're so sensitive, they easily perceive the needs of someone else, right? And they might, in anticipation of that, already respond to the need of the person without that other person having said anything about that. So it's easy for highly sensitive people to take on the emotional state of others or being impacted by that. So, but also to perceive maybe certain, cues as expectation from the other that they have to do something about it. So I think being very clear about your own sensitivity and the sensitivity of your partner, and then to put, to make sure that expectations are clearly communicated and boundaries are also communicated wherever necessary. Much of that might be the boundaries that individuals need to figure out for themselves. But yeah, communication will be key because a highly sensitive person will perceive many cues that are nonverbal. a low sensitive person might not perceive those and then might not be really aware of it.
Doctor, with the political climate, with the world going through what we've gone through, we're still going through many conflicts in the world. There's climate change, there's poverty, there's recession coming up. So I feel a lot of people perceive, the news, the media, in very negative ways. Is it because, of course, like you said, environmental influences the way we think? But are we then all becoming extremely sensitive? Uh, is there a way we can detach?
I think, well, as you said, the world is in a challenging place right now. But there always have been challenges in this world, and more for some people than for others. So people deal differently with that. Yes, at the moment the news are quite worrying. The talks about a third world war, the end of the world with climate change, and all those things. I think the news are to be blamed by emphasizing all the negative, because obviously there's also positive things happening, right? There's new, better treatments for, significant and serious illnesses. Actually, the infant and child mortality has been decreased substantially. There are now more people in education than have ever been in the history of the world.
Right.
So there's lots of good news as well, but usually we hear the bad news. So I think it's important to be aware of what we expose ourselves to. When I read certain newspapers, it makes me feel quite pessimistic about the future of this world. So I think there's certain ways of how news are communicated which may not be helpful, particularly for a highly sensitive person. It's just additional noise. So sometimes it's sufficient to just read the headlines, um, and to read the headlines from more serious news outlets. Yeah. So another thing is to, rather than just keep it inside and process ourselves, to talk about those issues with other people. I think that's very important. And we know that stress levels decrease substantially when people support each other. And I think that's one of the reasons the pandemic was so difficult, because people were left alone. But when you put a few people together and they share the problem that they experience with each other, just that alone will help them and make them feel the situation might be a little bit better, because they feel understood, or they have been able to share it with others. So talking about these things, talking about the things that worry people, is probably going to be helpful.
Doctor, like we are talking about highly sensitive people, we've also seen, a lot of topics on narcissism on social media, on how narcissistic people are becoming, how detached they are becoming. So we have two extremes, one of narcissism, one of highly sensitive people. Is there a way that we can, like you said, it's a genetic predisposition. People may be highly sensitive, but to the ones who are not, the ones who are aggressive, violent, is there a mechanism where we can train them towards, self-compassion, kindness, and sensitivity?
That's a really good question. And actually, we don't know very much about low sensitive individuals. Most of the research has focused on highly sensitive ones. And for a long time, people didn't even think about the low sensitive ones. But we found in our research that about 30% of the population is low in their sensitivity. So just as we have about 30% that are high in their sensitivity, and the rest are somewhere in the middle. So clearly there's a group that is characterized by specifically low sensitivity. And we don't really have much information about them. We have hypotheses that it may be related to some other traits, but we haven't really done much research on that. So most of the research has focused on across the whole spectrum of sensitivity, with a particular focus on the high end, but not much of the low end. But I think that's a very important future direction of research, is to understand who are the low sensitive children, the low sensitive adults, and how can we, what would benefit them? Because if they don't really respond to psychological interventions, maybe they respond more to something else. Maybe it's more physical activity, or maybe they just need more of everything. So it's a big question mark at the beginning, at this stage, and not really anyone has focused on that.
So my only question was, if parents today identify, that their children are lacking the sensitivity, the empathy, the kindness that they want their kids to have, because of the bullying environment, because of things becoming negative in school environments, can parents, at home do something about it?
I think so, but I mean, I don't know the research on it. I don't know how effective it is, but children can learn empathy. It's always a learned um, ability or competence, and I think they learn by behavior being modeled to them, so by the parents showing empathy, and then by having direct conversations about that and trying to explain, when a child hits another child and the other child is crying, then it would be important to explain to the child, look, you hit this child, that was really painful, and now the child is crying, and that's the child doesn't feel nice right now. So, you should what should we do about this situation? To just help them to understand how other people might be feeling, and also what can they do to alleviate that, and to help the other children. So I think much of that is learned in the interactions with parents, and then also as they start interacting with other children and they have conflict and they want the same toy. I think in the beginning, they completely depend on an adult helping them navigate this and saying, or maybe you can have it first for a bit and then you can share it, and then the other child can have it. So these are all simple strategies to deal with conflict. I think a highly sensitive child will probably find it a little bit easier to understand that, and a low sensitive child may take a little bit longer to
Yeah.
understand that.
So, doctor, my last question is, is there any intervention for friends, family, to be very supportive to a highly sensitive child? Because maybe, like we said, they're processing deeper. There may be a huge impact about negative experiences as well as the positive ones. So are there any supportive mechanisms that we can start right from scratch?
So I don't know any specific intervention, but I would say any good parenting program will result in parenting practices that would be helpful for sensitive children as well, because they usually focus on positive parenting, having a good relationship with your child, explaining your child exactly, what they need to do, what they can do, what they can't do, and then to have clear consequences in place that are not violent, not physical punishment, but maybe removing a privilege. So I think all of that would be helpful for a highly sensitive child. We actually found in our work that the permissive parenting style, where the parent just let the children do whatever they want to do, is not helpful for highly sensitive children. They benefit from having clear structures and clear boundaries. Most children do. So, yeah. Generally, any good intervention will probably benefit a highly sensitive child if they have a specific need. But I think it's also important to understand that sensitivity is not a diagnosis, it's not a disorder, it's just a temperament or personality trait. And some children are more sensitive, and most of these children do perfectly well. Some of them may develop problems if their environment is not well fitted to their temperament. And if that's the case, it would be important to look at the environment and see what can we change in the environment. Can we provide more structure? Do we need to provide different or more support for the child? Maybe the child would benefit from going to a different school.
Yeah.
Maybe, things like that.
So, doctor, last thoughts on the positive part of psychology. Any, do you want to leave us with anything positive that the research that you're doing, any books that you're reading, in terms of positive developmental experiences that we can give to the youth?
Yeah, so I just think that's fundamentally important to development is about the development of, skills and new abilities and not preventing problems. So I think it's very important when it comes to parenting and to be focused on what do I want my child to develop? What competence do I want my child to develop rather than, what are behaviors I don't want to see? I think often it's too easy to focus on the problems, the behaviors that we want to avoid. So I think it's important to be clear about the competencies that we want the children to develop and then provide opportunities for them to develop those competencies. And just to know that, many parents will be highly sensitive themselves, right? About 30% of parents will be highly sensitive. That means they may find certain aspects of parenting more stressful when the children are loud or chaotic. They might feel more easily overwhelmed and overstimulated. So it's also for parents really important, for highly sensitive parents, it is important to have good coping strategies, emotion regulation strategies in place, and to find space each day where they can decompress, where they can recharge and recover.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, doctor. So I hope this has helped our viewers. Thank you so much. Let us all identify the sensitivity in us and also express it to the other. Thank you.